In the half-light of a cave, long before cities, long before writing, someone painted a body they knew could kill them. A vast shoulder. A lowered head. Horns curved like deliberate weapons. The animal on the wall was not a cow. Not yet. It was an aurochs, the wild ancestor of cattle, enormous, volatile, and so powerful that even centuries later Roman writers struggled to describe it without reaching for exaggeration. That is where this story feels as though it should begin. With an image. With charcoal and ochre. With a beast still fully inside the world of wilderness. And yet the familiar version of cattle history usually begins somewhere else entirely. It begins with control. A hearth, a village, a few manageable animals in the Fertile Crescent more than 10,000 years ago. From that point, the story seems simple enough. Humans domesticated cattle, cattle spread with farming, and eventually the modern cow appeared, multiplied, and remade the human world. For a long time, that was close to the accepted shape of things. Reasonable. Efficient. Almost tidy. But ancient DNA has a way of disturbing tidy stories. Because when researchers began reading genomes not from modern breeds alone, but from ancient bones, wild and domestic, scattered across thousands of years, the old picture started to lose its edges. The origin of cattle did not disappear. But it became stranger. Less like a single event. More like a long negotiation between people, climate, migration, and animals that refused to remain neatly separated into wild and tame. And the first sign that something was wrong was silence. Not the silence of missing evidence. The silence of a bottleneck. When scientists examined ancient cattle DNA from Southwest Asia, they found that early domestication seems to have drawn from a surprisingly narrow maternal pool. In other words, the first cattle may have come from only a small number of female aurochs. That alone is an eerie thought. Out of all the massive, dangerous wild cattle moving through those ancient landscapes, only a handful seem to have passed through the narrow gate into true domestication. It suggests that the beginning was not grand. Not a sweeping conquest of nature. Something smaller. Riskier. Perhaps even improvised. A few captured animals. A few surviving lineages. An act so consequential that today cattle and their descendants make up a staggering share of the world's mammalian biomass, yet so fragile at the start that it may have depended on remarkably few mothers. If that were the whole story, it would already be extraordinary. But it was not the whole story. Because once those first domestic cattle began to move, the boundary between managed herd and wild world did not stay closed. Ancient DNA increasingly suggests that after domestication, cattle did not simply spread outward as a pure, sealed lineage. They encountered other aurochs populations across different regions, and they mixed with them. Again and again, the wild returned. This is one of the deepest reversals in the entire story. We tend to imagine domestication as a door that shuts. First there is the wild animal. Then there is the domestic one. Two categories, cleanly divided. But cattle do not seem to have followed that script. A major genomic study of ancient Near Eastern cattle found regional differences that are mostly blurred in modern breeds. Early domestic cattle in Anatolia appear closest to the primary domestication source, but as herds spread, local wild cattle contributed significant ancestry in other places, including Southeast Europe and the southern Levant. The old model of one origin followed by simple diffusion began to look incomplete. There was still a cradle. But there were also echoes, incorporations, and returns. Then, in 2024, a broader ancient DNA study of the aurochs itself widened the ground under our feet. Researchers analyzing genomes across 50,000 years found that the aurochs was not one uniform beast stretched across Eurasia. It contained at least 4 distinct ancestral populations: European, Southwest Asian, North Asian, and South Asian. Even within Europe, there was more internal diversity than many had assumed. In effect, the animal humans were domesticating was not a single wild template. It was already a mosaic of populations shaped by deep time, glaciation, isolation, survival, and re-encounter. That matters because it changes the meaning of the cow. The cow was never simply the domesticated aurochs, as though one stable species had been tamed and copied. Domestic cattle emerged from one part of a much larger, older, genetically structured world. And after that emergence, they continued to absorb pieces of that world. The wild did not vanish at the moment of domestication. It lingered in the bloodstream. The cave painting begins to look different now. Not like a prologue to a finished story, but like the presence of something that would remain inside the story far longer than anyone suspected. And then there is climate. Some of the most unsettling findings in ancient cattle genomics are not about domestication in the narrow sense at all, but about environmental crisis. Around 4,000 years ago, cattle across the greater Near East underwent a dramatic genetic shift. Ancient DNA indicates a widespread influx of zebu ancestry, Bos indicus, the humped cattle whose domestication traces to South Asia and the Indus region. What is striking is not just that this happened, but when. The shift appears around the time of the so-called 4.2 kiloyear climate event, a period of severe, prolonged drought associated with disruption and collapse across parts of the ancient world. The first great states of Mesopotamia and Egypt were under stress. Ecologies were changing. Water was unreliable. Herding itself would have become a different kind of calculation. And into that pressure came new cattle genetics from the east. The evidence suggests this introgression may have been male-driven, perhaps through the selection of zebu bulls better adapted to arid conditions. If so, the history of cattle is not merely the history of domestication. It is the history of ancient herders editing survival into their animals under the pressure of a changing sky. That is another quiet correction to the older story. Cattle did not simply spread because humans liked them. They changed because civilizations were forced to change with climate, and because the animals that fed empires had to endure what empires could not control. By now, the idea of a single origin story is beginning to feel not just incomplete, but almost too modern in its neatness. And still the revisions keep coming. In East Asia, ancient genomes have begun to show that early cattle history there was also more local, more entangled, than a simple import model would suggest. A recent study of ancient bovine remains from China found that the first domesticated cattle in the Yellow River region derived about 10% of their ancestry from local aurochs. Not everywhere. Not evenly. But enough to matter. Again, the same pattern returns, domestic herds arriving, then absorbing something from the wild populations already there. Not contamination. Not accident in the trivial sense. History. Even the aurochs of East and North Asia turned out to be distinct from Western aurochs, though not completely isolated from them in deeper prehistory. The old map dissolves. In its place is a restless biological geography in which cattle are formed not once, but through repeated episodes of movement and mixture. And then Africa complicates the picture further. For years, scholars have debated whether African taurine cattle were simply descendants of Near Eastern domestic cattle that later mixed with local wild aurochs, or whether North Africa may also have witnessed a more independent domestication process. Ancient genomic data from Iron Age Tunisia do not settle the question completely. But they do keep the debate alive in a serious way. Those cattle show patterns that can be explained by post-domestication hybridization with local aurochs. At the same time, the evidence does not entirely rule out a more distinct North African trajectory. That uncertainty matters. Not because mystery is fashionable, but because it reminds us that the origin of cattle may not be singular in the way popular retellings prefer. There was a foundational domestication in Southwest Asia. That seems well supported. But the making of cattle as a global animal was not a one-time invention followed by passive replication. It was cumulative, regional, permeable. At moments, unresolved. Which brings us back to the title question hidden inside this whole subject: if the origins of cattle were never what we thought, then what were they? Perhaps this. Not a clean beginning, but a braided one. A small domestication event from a limited maternal base. Early dispersal with farmers. Repeated encounters with distinct wild aurochs populations. Persistent male-mediated admixture. Climate-driven genetic turnovers. Later incorporations from zebu lineages. Regional histories in Asia and Africa that resist being flattened into one straight line. In other words, cattle did not emerge from the ancient world as finished products. They were assembled across centuries by movement, adaptation, and contact. They are less like copies of an original domestication and more like living archives of ancient thresholds, between village and steppe, drought and survival, wild herd and human design. That may be the strangest revelation of all. When we look at a modern cow, we are tempted to see familiarity. Soft muzzle. Slow eye. Pasture animal. A creature so ordinary it disappears into the background of agriculture, food, labor, and landscape. But inside that familiar body is a record of dangerous wild oxen once painted on cave walls, of ice age separations, of recolonized continents, of ancient drought, of trade routes, of breeding decisions made by people who never knew they were reshaping the genetic future of one of the most consequential animals on Earth. The domestic cow is not the opposite of the aurochs. It is what remains after the aurochs was narrowed, scattered, carried, crossed back, and changed. So the old image in the cave does not belong only to prehistory. In a way, it is still here. Not intact. Not visible in the old form. But not gone either. The horns have shortened. The danger has been managed. The body has been recruited into human time. Yet the deeper story, the one ancient DNA is now piecing together from bone and silence, suggests that cattle never fully left the wild behind. They carried pieces of it forward, region by region, century by century, until the animal we call familiar became one of the most layered inheritances of the ancient world. And perhaps that is why this story lingers. Because it is not only about where cattle came from. It is about how human history itself is made. Not by replacing nature with civilization in a single dramatic stroke, but by entering into long, unstable relationships with living things, relationships that keep changing both sides. In the cave, the painted aurochs still faces us through the dark. Once it looked like a beginning. Now it looks more like a witness. And if these are the kinds of ancient traces you like following into the present, stay with us for the next one.